Hello, this is my final project for this class. I will be talking about childhood development and be answering the questions for our final project. So first I'm going to be talking about the physical development. I'm going to be talking about normative behaviors in physical development. The first behavior that I'm going to be talking about is sleep. So, for the first portion of childhood, newborn to toddlerhood, sleep is considered to be very, very important. That is when you develop the hormones, because the hormones are released when you're sleeping, when you're a kid. That's how you grow and you change. So, for newborns, the average is 18 hours per day. Ooh, wish I was a newborn, but it can range from 10 to 21 hours. So typically you do like 3.5 hours at a time in the first few months, and then after that it extends to 10.5 hour spans of sleep. And then the goal is to sleep through the night by 6 months. That's not including sleep regressions and all that. Now, when you are about 9 months, the average sleep that you need to be getting is about 14 hours, with that being 11 hours at night and then 3 hours during the day, so 3 hours of nap time. And then when you're 1 year old, the average you're supposed to be getting is about 14 hours, again with that 11 hours nighttime and then 2.5 hours daytime. And then when you're 3 years old, the average is about 13 hours with 11 hours nighttime and 2 hours daytime. Obviously, that can change. Every day is different, and children want different things on different days, but this is what is typical and normative for these age groups. With sleep, when you're a baby, it's very important to consider a lot of factors. Number one being SIDS. So SIDS is sudden infant disease or death syndrome, and SIDS can be affected by the way that a child is sleeping. So it is very important to make sure that child is sleeping in the environment that they're supposed to be sleeping in, and in the way that they are supposed to be sleeping in. And then it's also can be affected by people's culture and environments too. Some cultures it's much more popular to sleep in the bed when you are an infant, but that can lead to SIDS, and sleeping in the bed can also lead to other problems because they are so fragile during that period. So sleep is very, very important during that period of time, and there are lots of decisions that parents have to make revolving sleep. And then in early childhood, it's recommended that children get about 10 to 13 hours. That can not include a nap, just depending on the child. But naps do start going away, so most of their sleep is supposed to go to nighttime. So you have to make sure that they're getting enough sleep during the night, and that's the most important part of early childhood sleep development. And then when it goes to middle childhood, sleep declines even further to about that 10 hours, about from 11 hours to 10 hours, and then even to 9 hours. So it's really important to get enough sleep, be getting that 9 hours, because research shows that kids who get enough sleep, they have better attention skills, they have better learning, memory, behavior, emotional regulation, mental health, physical health, and just an overall quality of life. That's a quote from the Cleveland Clinic, and all of my quotes are in my outline and they are all cited, but just for reference, that is from the Cleveland Clinic. So sleep again is very important in middle childhood, and in all of childhood. Now, when it gets to late childhood, that's when sleep can get tricky, because there are environmental factors that can affect how adolescents and late childhood kids sleep because they have school, and school sometimes is really early. Even in Nevada, schools are super early, and so that can affect certain amounts of sleep that people are getting. And if children do not get enough sleep, it can affect their quality of work, their homework, and it can affect a lot of different things. And they don't get enough sleep because sometimes they're doing homework, or sometimes they are engaging with technology, they are socializing. But the brain isn't made to be awake that early as sometimes they have class, and that can affect their level of sleep as well. So it's really, really important to make sure these kids are getting enough sleep, especially because they have so many factors that get in the way of them getting that quality sleep time. And so that is for the first development of our physical development. And we are going to go into physical growth, so actual physical growth. So for newborn to toddlerhood, the average newborn weighs about 7.5 pounds and is about 20 inches long. And they first start to lose their water weight, and then after they lose, it's about 5 to 7% of their birth weight. They will double their birth weight by 4 months, triple their birth weight, and 1.5 times their height in the first year. They will get to 32 to 35 inches and a quarter of adult weight by 2 years old. And that's pretty much the basis for physical growth within that first year. Their brain's growing, their body's growing. Then in early childhood, they grow about 2 to 3 inches in height per year, and then they gain about 5 to 10 pounds per year. And they, both boys and girls, they can get slim because like their trunk lengthens, and they tend to decline that extra body fat, and it can increase to muscle. And then additionally, their center of gravity will get lower. Things that can affect their growth during this time include nutrition, SES, sometimes their genetics or even their ethnicity, their prenatal environment, and their growth hormone deficiency. So if they do have one, that can affect their level of growth and their rapid growth, or their rate of growth, I should say. And then moving on to middle childhood, on page 239 of the textbooks, it says, these children coming from middle childhood, they come in all shapes and sizes, heights, weight, and ability. So this is the time when they get to be much more variable, what is average for them. They still will gain about 5 to 7 pounds and grow 2 inches, but they can have growth spurts, and at different times during this time, they do tend to slim down, gain muscle strength, bone strength. They tend to stretch their muscles and ligaments. That can lead to some growing pains at night, especially during this middle childhood phase. And then with late childhood, they are rapidly increasing. They tend to have growth spurts again, and they can increase their height, their weight, and that's as a result of puberty that tends to happen during this period. And then they can have a release of growth hormones, thyroid hormones, and androgens, and that is during puberty. And then males tend to experience growth spurt about 2 years later than females, and then they have accelerated growth spurts in various parts of their bodies, and then it becomes like a fairly regular thing of growth spurts. And they can have like ununiform growth, so they can have sort of out of proportion bodies during this period of time because of their weird growing during puberty. And then puberty can make their bones more brittle, makes them grow muscle faster, and specifically men tend to grow more muscle faster than females during this period of time. They will first grow in their extremities, so their head, their hands, and their feet, followed by their arms and their legs, and then their torso and their shoulders. So, to review for that physical development, we talked about sleep and actual physical growth. To go to our examples, our case studies that we did, some moments that were relevant to physical growth include from birth, Marcus slept in the same bed with his parents. Lee and John parents believe that this not only improves bonding with Mark and Mark's sense of security, but it also initially made nighttime feeding easier since Lee exclusively breastfed him until he was 6 years old. So this is talking about different conditions of sleep, which we talked about. Some doctors might advise against this type of sleeping because it can be safe, and with SIDS, it's important to give children their own space to sleep in, but at the same time, that can change depending on how that person, how their environment is and what their environment is. And in some cultures, it's just much more popular to sleep within the bed. But additionally, in one story, it says that Leo slept an average of 11 to 12 nights, or 11 to 12 hours per night, and took a regular nap around late afternoon. So that was normative behavior. Leo is about 48 inches tall, weighs 77 pounds, and he played several sports, which was also normative behavior. But he doesn't get to sleep until almost 10, and then he would wake up at 6, and that is not normative behavior because that is not enough sleep for the age range that he was in during that time. So those are references to the case studies in physical development. Moving on to cognitive development. So I decided to speak about memory and language development. So memory in newborns to toddlerhood, they start to develop implicit memory, so memory from habits, skills, unconscious recall, also called procedural memory. That is what develops first. And then explicit memory, that's like facts, names, conscious recall, that can develop in late infancy and toddlerhood. At 6 months, it lasts about 24 hours. By 20 months, it may last up to 12 months. So this is a constant thing that is developing, but they can have infantile amnesia. Adults typically do not recall early memories, probably due to prefrontal lobes not being fully developed during infancy and early childhood, which makes sense. First year, they are orienting and they are partaking in the investigative process, and they are starting to recognize objects, features, and trying to figure out locations. So they are able to be directed to locations. And that is it for their newborn to toddlerhood. In early childhood, they start to develop sort of an accuracy of memory, and that is influenced by different things like their environments. They tend to be more susceptible to suggestion. So, for example, preschoolers are more vulnerable than, let's say, older kids. So they, and this was evidence in the Leo story when he talks about like the cookie story. He was younger, he didn't realize that he was actually losing some of the cookie, and then when he gets older, he gets better spatial awareness, so he recognizes that, and then he was able to play that same trick on his younger sibling. So that is an example of that. And then preschoolers tend to have more advanced verbal abilities and self-control, are less susceptible to suggestions. And then they can improve their ability to remember time and location of events. So that becomes improved in their memory. And then they can improve just general memories about themselves. And then when we get to middle childhood for memory, we talk about long-term memory. So that is being developed. So like their permanent storage, that unlimited long-term memory is being developed, and that increases with their age. And those improvements reflect the knowledge that they have learned, which makes sense because they're getting older, they're learning more things. And they show superior memories in area of their expertise. So sometimes they're more interested or just generally more knowledgeable in one or two subjects. So they'll have better memory with those subjects. And then they tend to, when they get older, they tend to remember like the gist of things rather than like verbatim. So they remember kind of the general idea versus what actually is being said. So their knowledge in their memory is based on their motivation to remember something, their past experiences, and their opportunity to remember that. And then that autobiographical memory becomes more detailed, which makes sense because they're getting older, they're starting to remember things in a different way. And then when they get to late childhood, we start to talk about like not just memory, but processing that memory. So information processing. So we start to deal with the working memory and then develop slowly. It's still not what it is with an adult. So it's still not the type of memory that adults have, but we're getting there. And then we are starting to understand and memorize language. We're able to comprehend language, math skills, problem solving. All of those things are continuing to develop. We are starting to develop flexibility in our memory, so understanding strategies and perceptions can change. So we start to be more flexible with how we are memorizing something. And then we are developing that executive function, which means we are gaining the ability to screen out unwanted information and focus on relevant information. So we are able to sort of memorize or focus on what we want to focus on and remember what we want to remember. And that's all for that portion of time. And that when we relate to the case, when we talk about Leo, he really likes math, so he is very good in math, and he knows more skills and remembers and retains more in math. But in language and in English, he's struggling more and less interested in it, which means that he is not able to remember and retain that information as much. So moving on to language, when we go to newborn to toddlerhood, so at 4 months, they start to babble, ba, 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 ba. They can have expressions, they can copy sounds, they can cry in different ways. So whether they're hungry, they're in pain, they're sad, or they're tired. And then 6 months, they start to make sounds that sound like sounds. They might start to string vowels together, and then they'll take turns with parents making those sounds. They can even respond to their own name at 6 months. They might show that they're happy or when they're sad, or I guess displeased is more appropriate. They start to say consonant sounds, so and b, maybe even d. And then at 9 months, they should start to understand the meaning of no. They might make lots of different sounds like ba 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 ba, ma 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 ma. They might copy sounds of others. And then at 1 year, they should be able to respond to simple requests, so simple things that we ask of them, go here, come here, stuff like that. They should be able to make sounds and change in tone, so it sounds more like actual talking. They say mama, dada, uh-oh. They should be trying to say words. 18 months, they should say several words, shake their head no, point to things that they want. And then at 2 years, they should be able to point to things and people that they know. They might know familiar people. They might even know body parts. They could say sentences with 2 to 4 words and follow simple instructions and repeat words maybe that they've overheard. So that's for language. When we go back to the case studies, we had lots of pretty much normative behavior in those case studies. So to go back to that, so Mark's language development emerged gradually. At 1 year, he was babbling, putting few words together like mama and dada, pretty normative. And then Mark, he had begun to point to different animals that he saw when he was outside, and he called them all Bud, which was the name of their family dog. Although it's not accurate, it's pretty normal for generalizing. That's normal behavior. And then moving on into early childhood, at 3 years, they would follow instructions. Sorry, this is becoming really long. I have a lot to say. So they follow instructions with 2 or 3 steps. They sometimes can name familiar things. They can say words like I, me, you, some plural words like cars, dogs. They can talk well to strangers most of the time. They might be able to carry on sentences with 2 or 3, or carry on a conversation with 2 or 3 sentences. At 4 years, they might know some grammar, have understanding of some like pronouns, prepositions and stuff. They might be able to say their first and last name. And then at 5 years, they might be able to speak clearly, tell a story with like full sentences, maybe even say their name and address. So middle childhood, they'll start to increase their knowledge about language. They'll be able to increase their vocabulary, so it will generally increase from like 14,000 words to 40,000 words, so there's a big jump there. They'll begin to categorize words in like parts of speech, understanding complex grammar, being able to use things like similes and metaphors. They should generally be better at conversations. The stories will become much more complicated that they're telling. They're able to use language in a more connected way. So relating one sentence, relating one sentence to another. And then in late childhood, they should have developed most of their general language skills, but they start to think about language in a more abstract way, and they start to understand information in a more abstract way. They can think about things in a deeper way, and their interpretation of language will just change because of that. So they can approach problems at different levels, and they can use language in a more introspective way, thinking about their own thoughts and feelings, and thinking about other thoughts and opinion and feelings within their age group. So their usage of language becomes much more complex in that late childhood stage. Now we're moving on to social development. First thing that I want to talk about is emotions. So I'm going to be talking about emotions and personality. So for emotions in newborn to toddlerhood, first 6 months, they should generally feel surprise, joy, anger, sadness, just those general emotions. Nothing too complex or complicated. And then in that first to 2 years, they'll start to experience things like embarrassment, guilt, joy, but obviously depending on how they're raised, will change how they feel those emotions. And they might even feel things like jealousy, and then they can express their emotions in a different way, especially to their caregivers and their caretakers. They can modify their emotional expression in response to their parents' emotional expressions. So let's say that their parent reacts very aggressively to something, they're gonna mimic their parents' expression. So it's very important as a parent to monitor how you are expressing your emotions, because your child will replicate that. So they can start to develop that communication of their emotions to their parent. And moving on to early childhood, they start to feel sometimes self-conscious of their emotions. They might be able to understand that they can refer to themselves, be aware of themselves having their own emotions. They start to feel pride and guilt. That is pretty much what is common in that early childhood stage. Again, they are still influenced by their parents' reactions, so how their parents react emotionally will change how they react emotionally. They might be able to talk more about their emotions, explain them more. They might understand sort of the consequences of those emotions, and then they might start to be able to reflect on them as well. They also might be able to develop emotional regulation depending on the child. They might be able to control how and when those emotions are being expressed to others, and then it will continue to increase their control from like age 2 to 6. That will lead to enhanced social competence, which means the more in control of their emotions they are, the more socially adept they are, the more might even friends they might have. And then moving on to middle childhood, they'll improve their emotional understanding, so they'll start to understand sort of more complicated feelings, not just like the basic sad, mad. They might start to develop effortful control, which means that's their ability to regulate those emotions depending on whatever circumstance, and depending on how high or low their effortful control is, might change their reactions to things. It might change their peer relationships as well. If they have a low effortful control, that means they have low control. That means that they are reacting when they're angry or frustrated, and it's evident to other people that they are feeling that way. Versus if it's high, they're able to control those emotional impulses and responses to things. And that can dictate a lot for that person. They might also use self-initiated strategies to redirect those feelings. So if they've learned how to redirect their feelings, they will do so in the way that they've learned how. And they might increase their capacity for empathy. And then moving on to late childhood. This is when they express a lot of complex emotions. They're able to process their emotions. They might be able to actually feel empathy towards other people. They might be able to even consider the events leading up to their emotional reaction so that they can understand them. They are able to increase their control over expressing those emotions, and they might develop that sense of belonging, understanding, controlling, enhancing, and trusting their own emotions. But late childhood is when emotions can get pretty complex, and they can feel lots of things at lots of different times, and maybe not even understanding why they are feeling those things, and maybe they do and are able to control their outward expression of those emotions. But their control is pretty much based on how they've been able to control it throughout their whole childhood. So if they've practiced high effortful control in the past, growing up, they probably will have high effortful control in their late childhood. And that is demonstrated with Leo. So Leo, even in his early childhood, when he gets angry, it's pretty evident that he's angry. He storms off and he has emotional reactions to things, and that just continues to increase throughout his childhood. to the point where he's actually known for those emotional reactions to others. So the last trait that I'm going to be talking about is personality. So starting personality off in newborn to toddlerhood. So this is like the basics of where their personality comes from. They start to feel, they might get some form of self-recognition in that later stage of toddlerhood. They get a general sense of people, objects, some sense of sensitivity, but it is really dependent in this time on how the caregiver, whoever's taking care of that child, reacts, because the more responsive, the more caring, trustworthy that caregiver is, the better the child's responses are going to be, and that's going to change how their personality adapts and changes, and they are going to become more self-aware as they go into that toddlerhood phase. They might even start to be able to describe themselves at the end of that toddler stage. Early childhood, they're going to really start to develop that parent or that personality trait. They're going to become little beings, so they're going to be really connected with their parents during this stage. They will be able to use their language to be able to make things happen, sort of governed by their conscience, so trying to do the right thing. They might be able to hear inner voices of self-observation. Parents will play a big role in this time because they will determine how that person leaves that stage, and then they will be able to develop that self-recognition, knowing that their self has certain traits, and even being able to describe themselves in an emotional way. They might be able to perceive others in emotional ways as well, and then they might not be as egocentric, but they might also be egocentric at the same time. And then moving on to middle childhood, for personality, they start to develop things like self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy, self-regulation. So just lots of discovering of themselves, who they are, what they're interested in, what makes them feel good about themselves. They start to really develop perceptive talking, or perspective talking. They are really able to rely on those peer relationships. So the more effective they are with those peer relationships, the better off they are usually. And then they generally just have an improved level of thinking, and critical thinking skills. And then in late childhood, we start to talk about identity versus role. So who they are, their personality is beyond just what they're interested. They want to know who they are in life. What do they want to do with their lives? They start to really think about like the bigger picture, not just who they are in that moment, but who they want to become. And then really starting to develop that sense of identity and that sense of self, in those times. And it's good for them to have a positive role model in finding their sense of self, because the more positive that role model is, the better off they'll be. And yeah, so those are the developments in childhood. I'm sorry this is going for so long. I had a lot of notes and a lot to say. So then we're going to be talking about the different theories that I took notes on. We're going to be talking about the different case studies that I found, and then this long video will be over with. So the first theory I want to talk about is Lawrence Kohlberg's levels of moral reasoning. So basically he had what we're going to talk about is the first two levels of morality reasoning, although really what's relevant in the stages that we talked about are those first two. So the pre-conventional morality and then the conventional morality. The last stage is less relevant to what we're talking about, just because it's less developed, and it's only really when you're in adulthood that you face that last level. So theory is basically, so when you're a young child, you're in the stage of pre-conventional morality, which means that you are focused on obedience and punishment. So the first stage is you focus on self-interest and punishment is avoided. So the example that they give is the man shouldn't steal the drug as he might get caught up and go to jail. So that is saying that we do what we do because we are afraid of the consequences if we don't do those things. Which in some way makes sense. Then stage 2, that is when we talk about individualism and exchange. So rewards are sought. A person at this level will argue that the man who should steal the drug because he does not want to lose his wife who takes care of him. So that is talking about individualisms and what you can get out of a situation. And then moving on to conventional morality. So that first stage is 0 to typically to like 9 years old, and then the next one is 10 to adulthood. So conventional morality is like older children, adolescents, and sometimes adults. And honestly, most adults. So that first stage, or stage 3, developing good interpersonal relationships. So that's what that stage is focused on. So focusing on situational outcomes. So the man should steal the drug because that is what good husbands do. And then stage 4 is about people make decisions based on law or formalized rules. So making a decision based on the law. You shouldn't steal because stealing is a crime. So that focuses on maintaining social order. And then there's another stage, but we won't really go into it because it's not really relevant for children. And then the next part I want to talk about is Erikson's theories. So he had theories about trust versus mistrust, and then initiative versus guilt, and industry versus inferiority. When I did additional research on this, they also talked about autonomy versus shame and doubt, but we didn't really go too much into that with our resources, so I won't go too much into it. But basically, trust, mistrust talks about if the child feels safe. So if the child feels safe, if the child trusts who the child is around, then the child will feel safe. Trust versus mistrust. And then theory 2, the initiative versus guilt, is revolving around how much power and control over the environment that child has and how much power are they trying to have. And if they have success, that means in that area that they get a sense of purpose. And then that also talks about how children who try to control too much of their environment end up getting disapproval. So we can relate that when Leo's trying to make up rules for games, people get frustrated, and then he gets frustrated because they're not listening to him, because he's trying to control too much of his environment when maybe it's not his place to. And then it goes into industry versus inferiority. So basically, children who are encouraged by the parent or teachers, they will feel confident and believe in their skills. So Leo didn't feel like he was being encouraged by his teachers, so he didn't feel confident in his skills, in his learning skills. And that's basically that. And then theory 3, that goes into Vygotsky's theory. And I really liked this theory. It's more like stages of, age stages, but it's basically talking about how social context can affect learning and knowledge. So zone a proximal development, range of tasks that are too difficult for the child to master alone, but can be learned with the guidance or assistance of adult or more skilled children. So basically talks about what the child can and can't do and how those skills are developed by the people around them, and how we can support children by a process called scaffolding, which means changing the amount of support that we have for that child. So maybe giving a lot of support in the beginning and then weaning them off that support. And then he talks about how to develop speech. He concentrated on like social and cultural environment of children and their interactions. He argued that development occurred first through children's immediate social interactions and then moved to the individual level as they began to internalize the reading. So it was a bit different than Piaget. I never know how to pronounce that guy's name. But I kind of liked his theory a little bit better, which is why I chose to talk about it. And then that is it for my theory. So we talked about Lawrence Kohlberg, we talked about Erikson, and then we talked about, all these guys have really hard to pronounce names. Okay. So sorry that this is so long again. I did not think it was going to be 40 minutes. I'm just going to go over the 2 factors that I decided to research about. So I basically decided to research the effects of, number 1, diet, and then number 2 being the divorce of Leo's parents. So it's very clear in the stories that Leo's diet isn't the best. It may be affecting his behavior and even his weight gain. When we did the research project, or when we did the project about Leo, I noticed that, Leo's weight gain was not normative. So maybe we want to research his diet, see what can be changed. So I had 2 studies that I found about diet affecting children. And one of them, which starts as From Dieting to Delight, it basically talks about how parents can affect how children view themselves through food. So the results said to date, studies have largely concentrated on parents' contribution to children's concerns about body shape, weight, and eating, yet growing body research is exploring how parents can protect their children from those concerns. By focusing on practices that support positive body image and eating behaviors, we aim to highlight how parents can contribute to children's resilience against diet culture, be allies in the fight against societal body-related pressures. So this would be saying that we should be telling Leo to focus on how he can have a positive body image and just creating better habits without the process of shaming him. So that might be something that will need to be focused on as Leo goes through his eating journey, is how do we have better positive outcomes and perspectives on things, and not including shame within that process. And then the other study that I did was about the influence of home and school environments on children's diet. And this basically said that the home environment can affect the child's diet, but typically the school environment isn't associated with what weight that child is. But it also says that physical activity has the largest association with someone's BMI. So that's how they did the study, is through BMI. So seeing how diet affects BMI. But I'm not sure that's the best way to look at things, is through BMI, because I don't know if that's the most inclusive thing. But it is important to understand how home and school environment can affect our BMI, which it does say that home environment does. So Leo doesn't have the best diet, especially when he's with his dad. So maybe cutting back on fast food and creating a better home environment where you can eat and do things in a different way, that might be really important for Leo moving forward. And then the last thing we're going to talk about is that second factor, which is divorce. Obviously, Leo's parents got a divorce. There are lots of studies about how divorce can affect people and can affect children. So the first study that I did was called The Divided World with Child Divorce and Long-Term Psychosocial Development. So it talks about how across family forms, the total amount of nurturance or involvement received was positively associated with self-esteem, purpose in life, life satisfaction, friendship quality and satisfaction, and academic performance. So that's basically stating that it's important to have good relationships in your family, and that can change when you get a divorce. So negatively related to distress, romance, relationship problems, mother-father differences in nurturance and involvement showed a largely opposite set of relationships. So divorce can really affect children's quality of life. So even if a divorce happens, not letting it affect that family can be really important in how you bounce back from that divorce. So my second study is about how parents feel about divorce and how that changes their self-efficacy. So originally, the parents in the study were found to have distress, but if they had stable, adequate support, then they were able to stabilize themselves and then, as a result, have more stable children. So understanding that the better that parent feels out of that divorce, the better outcome that child will have. So making sure that Leo's parents are in a good place so that Leo can be in a good place is really important. And obviously, you could argue that the divorce might be a factor in how he sees himself, because his self-esteem is starting to lower as he gets older. And maybe he feels like he is lesser than because of his parents' divorce. So making sure that he knows that his development had, no part in his parents' relationship. I'm so sorry this is so long. It is 47 minutes. I know you said 10 to 15 minutes. I'm just going to leave it as is because I did a lot of research and a lot of information. And thank you for listening for all this time if you did so. Thank you.